We are Fred Karno's army, a jolly lot are we. Fred Karno is our captain, Charlie Chaplin our steed. And when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser he will say, oh, oh, mein Gott, what a jolly fine lot, all the boys of Comedy Street.
Hello, and welcome to this special bonus episode of the Laurel and Hardy Blogcast. I'm Patrick Vasey, the author of the Laurel and Hardy blog, and the forthcoming book, Laurel and Hardy Silence. And in this bonus blogcast, we're stepping temporarily away from our usual chronological deep dive into the films of Laurel and Hardy, and instead, we're going to take a close look at a key individual in the boys' history. To mark the publication of his fantastic biography of Fred Karno, I talk with author David Crump about Karno's life and career, but importantly about his association with Stan Laurel and also about his time working for Hal Roach on The Lot of Fun. In addition, along the way, you'll also hear some excerpts from a couple of interviews with Stan Laurel himself as he describes his time with Karno in his own words. Now, I'm sure you're going to find this conversation with David fascinating, as Karno's story is so compelling. Oh, and we also have a welcome return of the Atoll question. So I think you're really going to enjoy this bonus blogcast. So if you're sitting comfortably, let's begin. Joining us on this special bonus edition of the blogcast is a man who has had a number of guises in his life, including as an actor, singer and playwright, and to that list he can now add the title author. In 2021, he published an extensive biography of music hall impresario Fred Karno, entitled Fred Karno, The Legend Behind the Laughter. Now, no discussion of Stan Laurel, Laurel and Hardy, or comedy in its wider sense can be complete without recognising the impact of Fred Karno. And so it is with great pleasure and much interest that I say, David Crump, welcome to the Laurel and Hardy Blogcast.
Oh, thank you, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. David, I'm really excited to chat with you today. Firstly, congratulations on the book. It's an incredible piece of work and a massive achievement. And I've got to admit, Karno is not somebody that I knew an awful lot about, and I'm probably not alone in that, but he's actually a massively influential part of the Laurel and Hardy story. So thanks ever so much for coming on to discuss Fred Karno with us today. And now the book is massive. It's about 600 pages, I think, from memory, and it is packed with just so much information. Really colourful stories about Karno and his associates. But what I'd really like to try and do today, if this is okay, is to talk about Karno, the man, and his life and career. But kind of if we can just have a specific focus on his involvement with Stan Laurel, and later with his albeit brief spell at the Hal Roach Studios. If that's all right, David. Fabulous. So to kick us off, what I tend to do with new guests on the blogcast is just to ask you sort of about your earliest memories of Laurel and Hardy, mm-hmm. and sort of how you were introduced to them, really, that kind of thing.
Well, I suppose it's literally sitting on my granddad's knee, watching old films on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning is my earliest memory of certainly watching old comedy. And that ranged from, Ealing comedies like The Lady Killers through to Laurel and Hardy. And actually, although I loved Laurel and Hardy, the comedian that stuck with me was Will Hay.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah.
My granddad loved Will Hay. He looked a bit like Will Hay, actually. And even as a fairly young lad, I remember laughing my head off at Will Hay films. And I just liked that physical comedy, juxtaposition with this sort of, it's a bit like Oliver Hardy, really. That person who is a little bit officious and, that dangerous combination of someone who thinks they're clever, but actually. So I loved Will Hay. I loved Laurel and Hardy, and the other kind of those British Ealing comedies of that time. And to be frank, Laurel and Hardy didn't particularly sort of take over my life at the time. But in later life, when I started acting and performing one way or another, I was gravitated to comedy, ended up writing pantomime. And really appreciated more and more the physical comedy, the value of physical comedy. And as a pantomime writer now and a panto dame, the fact is that a visual gag on stage will always get a much bigger reaction from the audience than a verbal gag.
Right.
And the other joy of a physical gag is you can actually do the same thing again and get a laugh again. You know, if you tell a verbal joke and you tell the same joke 10 minutes later, it isn't going to get a laugh. But
that's a good point. Yeah.
Do something physical and you can do pretty much the same thing 10 minutes later and it'll get a laugh again. And that, I think that's partly why that silent comedy still resonates with people, because actually I've seen them before, but it still makes you laugh.
Yes,
so that's certainly true of physical comedy, and Laurel and Hardy were, well, the masters, weren't they?
Yes, oh, absolutely. And so, as an actor, do you think you've sort of been inspired by, you know, the sort of the great movie comedians of old?
I certainly think that my ability, such as it is, to understand visual comedy and to be able to time a gag well, and, you know, particularly as a panto dame, to be able to work an audience. I mean, I've said to people that, you know, working an audience as a dame is, or as the lead comedian in a panto, is like playing a musical instrument. You can sense where the laugh's going, how long it's going to last, whether there's another one coming along, and just getting that timing right, and how long you can take over a double take, or, you know, a pause and a look to the audience. And that is something that it does come with experience, but I also think you've got to be born with a little bit of that. My granddad certainly had it. My dad's got it, and I like to think I've got it. And when you watch those physical comedians, it's just effortless. You can see it. And actually, I'll give you a good example of that timing, which is not from that era, but from my kind of era. I mean, I was born in 1970, so my real comedy heroes were Morecambe and Wise and Ronnie Barker, and, you know, I suppose. But if you watch the Four Candles sketch, with the two Ronnies, and everybody obviously focuses on Ronnie Barker, who, you know, he wrote the sketch. He's ostensibly the lead in that sketch. He's got all the punchlines in that sketch.
Four candles. Four candles. Here you are. Four candles.
No, four candles.
Well, there you are, four candles.
No, four candles. Handles for forks.
But actually, the genius of that is if you watch Ronnie Corbett,
yes,
after every punchline, the audience laugh, and Ronnie Corbett times his next line to perfection every single time. And if the audience laugh is rolling on, you see Ronnie, you know, go up and down the ladders twice instead of once, or he furters around in the box of bits because he knows the laugh is still going. And if I'm directing a show, I say to the comics, watch that sketch and listen for that laugh in the audience and wait for that crescendo to just peak and then go to the next line. And it's the beauty of the split-second timing that I love watching in Laurel and Hardy and others of that era. Will Hay actually said in an interview once something along the lines of, you know, you can be a split second wrong on timing of a gag and the gag is killed, you know, and it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and isn't that's? I'm sure I've read that in the book. That's sort of Karno training, isn't it? That's, you know, that's sort of really specific.
He was the master of that, and he was an absolute, draconian director in respect, in that it was his way or the highway, and you had to get it spot on. Hard taskmaster, but the result was that the comedians that went through his companies and his, you know, school of comedy, for want of a better description, the Fun Factory, many of them, certainly the most successful, ended up with those similar traits. You know, Stan Laurel, Charlie Chaplin, Will Hay, you know, they were all perfectionists. They were all they were interested in the minutiae. They weren't just performers. They were writers. They were directors. They wanted to, you know, get involved in the editing and the cutting and the, you know, certainly a Karno trait to want to control everything. I mean, Karno went from being an acrobat to a comedian to a producer, director, impresario. But his companies grew to the point where he even bought the company printing the posters, for his shows.
That's a control freak if ever heard one.
Absolutely. He wanted absolute control of every aspect of that production. And Chaplin certainly was the same. And Stan, as we all know, was the driving force behind the Laurel and Hardy pictures. So, yeah, it's definitely
So can you just sort of explain then a little bit about the genesis of the Karno book then? If we're sort of getting towards talking about the man himself. So how did you become interested in Fred Karno, and what made you want to sort of pursue his story so fully?
Well, I'd written a few shows. I'd written some pantomimes. I'd written some reviews. And I'm involved with a number of local theatre companies, various, and one of them from the top were looking to select their next show, which they were looking to do a musical. And we were looking at Underneath the Arches and Mac and Mabel, one being the story of the Crazy Gang, the other being Mac Sennett and the 1920s Hollywood film world. In the meantime, I'd had an incident at work, which was just one of those things. My secretary actually fell over a box in my office and said, "Oh, it's like Fred Karno's army in here." And I said, "What does that mean?" Because I'd never heard the expression before. And she said, "Oh, it's something my dad used to say. It just means it's chaos. It's all topsy-turvy." And I was fascinated. I Googled it. And at the time, going back 12 years ago, probably a bit more, there was very little on the internet about Karno at the time. I've had a little paragraph on a biography website that said something along the lines of Fred Karno, hugely famous circus acrobats, became an impresario, a colourful character, discovered Charlie Chaplin and Stan Laurel, died forgotten and in poverty. And I thought that sounds like somebody I should have heard of. Sounds like an interesting story. So I literally just wrote it on a scrap of paper, Fred Karno, and threw it in my tray of ideas, usually overflowing. And there it sat until we had this discussion at this theatre company about putting a show together. And with a little bit of digging, I realised that Karno was sort of the prequel to both of those stories, both Mac Sennett's story and Crazy Gang's story, in an indirect way. And that led me back to Karno. And I managed to find a dusty old biography from 1970, read it, and thought, actually, there's a story here. So I then wrote a show which I call Chaotic, which was Fred Karno's story set to music, and we staged that at the Old Rep in Birmingham in 2010. And in doing the research for that, I was eventually put in contact with one or two other researchers and writers, including AJ Marius and others. And they came and saw the show, and they introduced me to some members of the Karno family, Karno descendants. One of those, Louise, who was Karno's great-granddaughter, came to see the show, loved it, and said to me afterwards, "Oh, I've got an attic full of my granddad's stuff," which her granddad being Leslie Karno, Karno's youngest son. "And it's been in the attic for 40 years and nobody's interested. Would you like to have a look at it?" And I said, "Yeah, of course I would." So I went down to her house. We literally got these boxes out of the attic, and it was just an absolute treasure trove of contracts and photographs and
wow.
And most importantly, perhaps, personal correspondence from Karno and to Leslie, certainly in the later years of their career. That was an absolute revelation, because if you look at anything really written prior to this about Karno, it paints him as a pretty quite a brutal character, quite a dark character. Lots of books that say he was illiterate, this kind of thing, when in fact, quite clearly that was not the case. And when you're reading letters written by him to his grandchildren or, to within the family, you really see the other side of the character.
Yeah.
And I'd already, having read this Gallagher biography from 1970 or whatever it was, I'd already, and although I based my show on it, I already felt it was not an objective take on the book. It was largely written based on testimony of Karno's ex-wife's friends. So,
right, okay.
Slightly biased starting point. And Gallagher was a tabloid journalist at the time with the Daily Mirror, I think. And it really is a sort of a bodice-ripping character assassination, really.
Right. Okay.
So I just thought it wasn't particularly balanced, and that there must be more to it. Then I dug back further and found Karno's, pretty much his autobiography, really, which was published in, I think, 1939. It was written by Con West, who had been a Karno writer, but very much with Karno's approval. And that book talked a lot about Karno's career and his achievements, but nothing about his family. Gallagher's book really only talked about Karno's first wife, Edith, who, and she was put upon, there's no doubt about that, and it was a very, very tempestuous relationship. But that focused on that. And somewhere in between, I felt there was a fuller story. And thankfully, the information that the family shared with me filled in some of those gaps. And the advantage these days with the internet, it's a blessing and a curse, but there is so much material that you can now get to that wasn't available then, whether it's the British Newspaper Archive or Ancestry and all these, sites that make it so much easier to do the detective work and follow a trail. 10 years later, we've got the book that is now in front of us.
Yeah, absolutely. What a book it is. So can you talk a little bit about the background to Karno? So who was Karno? Where did he come from, and how did he become this master of comedy? Well,
he was born in Exeter in 1866, and although the family moved away from Exeter when he was probably 5 or 6, he always considered himself a West Country man. They moved to Nottingham, where he was brought up. His father was a cabinet maker, and I think about the age of 14 or so, he went to work in the laceworks in Nottingham. But he quickly developed a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit and, got various part-time jobs working in a barber's and cleaning milkmen's carts in the evening, like this. So he quickly realised that with a bit of hard work, he could earn a few pennies. But when he effectively left school, he got a job as a plumber's apprentice. And in those days, you were indentured for, I think it was 7 years as an apprentice. And if you broke your indentures, you went to jail. So,
oh, wow.
He was very much tied into that.
Yeah.
And he went to 2 jobs that were particularly important. One was at the local prison in Nottingham, where he recounted how 2 inmates who were set to help him with his drainage problem regaled him with stories of comic murderous exploits, which he found highly amusing. And then the other job was he went to do a plumbing job at a gymnasium in Nottingham. And although we don't know for sure where that was, there is a gym very close to where he lived, which is now still there. It's called Rock City now. It's a quite well-known Nottingham venue. But then it was a music hall and a gymnasium and a general civic building. So anyway, he went to this job. He saw gymnastics for the first time. The owner encouraged him to have a go. He took it up, and he was a natural. Quickly, very accomplished, and was pretty soon winning competitions at local fetes and galas and so on. Then he went to see an acrobat called Old Veen perform in Nottingham, and afterwards collared him at the stage door and said, "Can I please be your assistant? Everything you do, I can do."
Wow.
So Olveen gave him an audition and took him on as an assistant. And then they ran he literally ran away with the circus at that point. And he was fortunate because at that very moment, his plumbing boss died. Unfortunate for the plumber, but it released Karno from his indentures, which meant
right.
He was then free to run away with the circus, which he did. And the next few years, he toured, performing as an acrobat in circuses and doing other things like performing as a circus clown, which he didn't particularly enjoy, but all the acrobats used to muck in with the clowns. And that did teach him how to work an audience, that early physical comedy that he combined with the acrobatics. When he then subsequently ended up in the music hall performing as an acrobat within a troupe of acrobats called the Four Aubrey's, then comedy was starting to be introduced. And if you think about variety performers like magicians or tightrope walkers, even today there will be some comedy. And or certainly the most popular ones, there'll be some comedy, and it's particularly good when there's a really an intense moment of tension, and then there's a gag because the audience has been built up this kind of like a coiled spring waiting for something to go wrong, something dramatic to happen, and then there's a bit of light and a joke, and it is released in this huge laugh, and Karno really learnt how powerful that could be, ultimately leading to him developing sort of a lot of pathos in his comedy that certainly the Chaplins and the Laurels and so on took very much on board. But we'll come back to that. So he'd found himself as a musical acrobat. He teamed up with a couple of guys in London outside Waterloo Station, where all the performers used to gather. They called it Poverty Corner because all the out of performers would be there. A troupe called the Karno, the Three Karnos, had been unable to perform. They were trapped up north somewhere at the Metropole Music Hall, and one of the local agents asked if anybody could cover for them. Karno and these two guys said, yeah, we'll do that. They went...
The Three Karnos, did you say?
Well, originally they were the Three Karnos. So they were covering for the Three Karnos, but it was Karno with a C. So it was Carno. They basically went in theory, they went in as imposters pretending to be the Three Karnos. They were a hit. They were retained, and subsequently, inevitably, there was a little bit of confusion between these various groups. So they changed C to a K. That's how they became the Karnos. The story of that is really quite complicated and took quite a lot of working out because there are various accounts of quite what happened, and I won't bore you because it's all in the book. But effectively, from that day forward, the man who had been Fred Westcott became Fred Karno.
Right.
The other two, which was Ted Teisel, who became Ted Karno, and Bob Sewell, who became Bob Karno. And they then ran as the Three Karnos for quite some time. So then what happened was Ted Teisel broke away and formed his own group, which he also called the Three Karnos.
Of course.
So you've now got three troupes all called the Three Karnos, all performing. And the original Karnos had also had a breakaway. So it was a nightmare trying to work out who was what and where.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay. Researcher's nightmare.
Ted, to help slightly, Ted changed his name to the Karno Trio. So Ted Teisel's the Karno Trio, Fred Karno is the Three Karnos at this point. However, if I had £1 for every time I read something about Fred Karno that is actually about the Karno Trio, I would be a wealthy man. So it's a real minefield for researchers. Anyway, Fred Karno and the Three Karnos then went on to just gradually greater things. They started off doing acrobats with some comedy. They ended up doing comedy with some acrobatics, really. It grew. He bought this slapstick, circus slapstick, very much to the music hall. And although there had been plenty of other troupes that had done similar things, if you look at the press of the time, there's no doubt that the critics really thought that Karno's material was cutting edge, innovative, original. And it's quite hard from this distance to understand why. You know, what difference between the Karnos and these other troupes that had gone before. It was clearly there because it's in black and white. The troupe of 3 became a troupe of 5, became a troupe of 10. Then that became 2 troupes of 5, that became 2 troupes of 10, that became 3 troupes, and so it went on until eventually, he ended up with 20 troupes touring all over Britain. They ended up all over the world. And some of them were Karno troupes, some of them were licensed Karno shows. And you can find Karno productions everywhere from South America to Russia to all over North America, Canada, South Africa, Australia. It just snowballed and snowballed. And one of the things that he did that was fairly unusual was that most musical performers would have an act. And this is obviously before radio, before television. And that act would be 20 minutes, 2 or 3 songs. And, some of those performers could literally have an entire lifetime career with that 20 minutes because there were, 600 musicals or whatever around Britain. You do one a week and it's 3 or 4 years before you're back at the Liverpool Empire and they've kind of forgotten the jokes and you can do it again. So there was a lot of that. Not every performer. I mean, there were plenty of performers who did have, other things. But Karno had 80-odd productions in his year career. And every 6 months or so, he would produce a new show. So, what started off as little acrobatic sketches eventually became full-blown musical comedies, with song and dance numbers. And then in the latter part of his career after World War One, it became full-on review. So he had this huge growth in both the number of companies and the material they were performing. To do that, he needed a lot of comedians. So he sort of got a headquarters building in Vaughan Road in Camberwell, which the building is still there. It's in Southall Road now because the road names have changed, but it's still there, which became known as the Fun Factory. And that he lived there with his wife Edith, but also it was the headquarters of the empire. They made scenery there. They had a menagerie of animals in the stables at the back. and
Wow.
the comedians would come there and rehearse and train. And in the morning, they'd all meet at the Fun Factory and then go off in Fred Karno's buses to wherever they were performing. And I've tracked about 3,000 individual performers who have appeared in a listing somewhere in a Karno show. So it became known as almost this training ground for comedians. And certainly in the early years, he had a very much an Alex Ferguson kind of approach where he would take on youngsters, unknowns, train in his image for two reasons. One, it meant that they would be Karno comics and do it the way he wanted them to do it. They would learn as youngsters. He didn't have to try and unteach bad habits or teach an old dog new tricks. But also they were cheap. So
Yes.
much cheaper to have your own comics and at 19 or 18 than to take on a named star. Having said that, and he's sometimes accused of being cheap for that, but if you were a Karno comic, you were perceived to be working for the best comedy producer at the time, and he gave you 52 weeks a year of employment. Whereas for the vast majority of musical performers, they certainly couldn't guarantee that. So he may not have paid the best wages. It was consistent work. Almost that difference between a full-time job somewhere and a freelance job, where the freelance you get paid more money, but it's a lot more risk. So this kind of comedy school, somebody described it as a nursery of nonsense.
That's good.
So many comedians came through that inevitably the next generation and the one after that, certainly British comedians, was just absolutely full of Karno comics.
Yeah. So obviously this is around, he's trying to get young comedians come in. And so is this where Sid Chaplin's brother, joins? Because he joined first, I believe. Is that right?
Sid was, he'd been in a show with Wal Pink show called Repairs, which was a sort of similar Karno show, really, sort of slapstick plumbers and decorators.
Yeah.
We're not quite sure how he joined Karno, but probably Karno saw that show and approached him.
Right.
Sid was Chaplin's older brother, as I'm sure everyone knows, and he quickly became a lead comic with Karno. He toured in America with Karno not very long after joining him, about 1906, 07, I think. And Sid, Karno comics didn't tend to be named. AJ Marriott said to me once that Karno was a bit like Andrew Lloyd Webber, that it's Andrew Lloyd Webber's name above the door.
Yes.
You don't necessarily know who's playing the parts, but you know
Yes, of course.
because it's Andrew Lloyd Webber, and that's how Karno was. It was Fred Karno's name above the door and in the programme and on the posters, and you had no clue who the comedians were quite often. If you read the reviews of the time, sometimes critics are quite irritated that they don't actually know who it is they're watching. So although Sid was a star comedian, he wasn't necessarily named in the billing initially, although in later years that changed, and Karno realised that some of his comics started to get a following with the public such that putting their name on the poster was a benefit.
Yeah.
So Sid was very successful, and depending on what you believe, Sid persuaded Karno to give his little brother Charlie a go.
Yeah.
Karno thought Charlie Chaplin looked a little bit weedy and a little bit weak and probably hadn't got much about him, but because Sid was one of his leads at the time, he gave him a go. And the rest is history. Chaplin, developed as a comic till he gradually ended up as a lead comic in Karno's companies. And that's how he ultimately ended up going to America with a Karno company. And Stan, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners will know, Joined a little bit later, 1909, I think. And Stan always used to describe himself as Charlie's understudy, which is a little bit self-effacing, I think, typical Stan, really, that it is true that he was in Karno companies where Chaplin was the lead comic. Stan was in the ensemble, and if Chaplin had been unavailable or ill or whatever, then someone would have stepped into that part, and that someone, certainly by the time the sort of end of Karno's relationship with Chaplin and Laurel, that would have been Stan. I'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but I think it's not really true to say he was, always Chaplin's understudy. He was in the company, and they all, or a lot of them, were capable of playing each other's parts.
Yes, gotcha.
They were all, if you see the reviews at the time, the listing, they were all interchangeable as well between the sketches. There were, at any one time, there were probably 6 or 8 different productions, different sketches touring the country. And you'd see the comics jumping from one to another, whether that was because of geography or, illness or somebody learning a new sketch or whatever it might be. So there was a lot of interchangeable cogs in the machine. And it just became this huge empire that made Karno a relative millionaire in his day.
Yeah, the scale of it was absolutely incredible. Just going back to Stan joining the troupe, I'm just trying to remember in your book, you're mentioning actually when he was it through was Stan's father friendly with Karno?
We know for certain that Karno knew Stan's father, A.J. Jefferson. And A.J., again, as many of your listeners will know, was a theatre manager, an owner at times. He was an actor, he was a writer. And Stan had was keen to follow in his footsteps, I guess, and tread the boards. Karno performed at A.J. Jefferson's venues regularly. There were lots of listings where Karno was at an A.J. venue that had lots of similarities. They were both very good at self-promotion, which was quite unusual in those days. The musical artists used to rely on the venue, really, to sell tickets, and they'd just turn up on a Sunday or ready for the Monday or whatever. But Karno used to go to the town. He'd had a Rolls Royce before most people had a car. He'd break down in front of the local pub. There'd be some comedy antics with his chauffeur trying to get the car started. It was always one of his comics. They'd have a barrage balloon that would get trapped in the tram lines and rain leaflets down on people. They'd buy everybody in the pub a drink. There was a sketch called Jailbirds where Karno bought a Black Maria, basically a cage on wheels, and he used to put some of his convicts in the back of the Black Maria and drive them through the town. There was a great story about Jailbirds where Karno would put 2 comics dressed as convicts with 2 prison wardens on the train to arrive in the town completely separately to the company, get off the train at the station. The 2 convicts would escape, in inverted commas, and run through the town pursued by these prison officers and gather a crowd. And of course, they would eventually run to the theatre where the banner would unfurl, Karno. And A.J. Jefferson did very many similar things. So there was a story of him having a lion in a cage, ripping a dummy to bits, driven through a town. There was another one with a corpse with a dagger falling out of a hansom cab. So that kind of showmanship was definitely shared by them. It was when Karno was producing Mother Goose Panto at, I think it was the Theatre Royal in Glasgow in 1909. The Glasgow Grand it was, in 1909. And AJ at the time was managing the Metropole in Glasgow, and the story goes that he effected an introduction for Stan to Karno at those rehearsals. Stan had done a little bit, and his story of his debut is well known, but he'd done a little bit by then, and Karno gave him a job on the spot, packed him off to Manchester to join the Mummingbirds company there, and away he went.
So finally my dad got me this job with Fred Karno. So I joined the show, which Chaplin was with.
Yes, I understand that. Now, is this correct? My notes would also indicate that you were billed for a long time as Chaplin's understudy.
I was his understudy. I wasn't billed as
You were
such.
not billed as such.
No. So anyway, just before we left for America, a few weeks before, they wanted to put on a new show. So we rehearsed the show all week, and we had an opening date the following Monday. And on the Friday of the rehearsals, Chaplin turned the part down.
Why was that?
He didn't like it. It was a show called Jimmy the Fearless. So Karno came down to see the rehearsal, and Chaplin refused to play the part. We had an opening date the following Monday. So at the last minute, Karno put me into the part.
Now, had you been understudying this part to this
No,
time?
it was a brand new show.
Brand new
We'd all
show.
been rehearsing, you see.
Uh-huh.
So I had to switch parts. Well, I was only one of the gang as far as that. So I went on. We opened at the Hippodrome Theatre in West Ealing in London. And the show was quite a success. So I was congratulated by everybody and what have you. Well, Chaplin sat in front for 2 or 3 shows and decided then he liked the part. So I saw him back in the chorus. Because Chaplin was under contract and they had to pay him, so...
But his stature was not great in those days. And he was a relatively young man then, too.
Oh,
wasn't he?
yes, certainly. He was only a year younger than I was. A year older
A year
than
older.
I was, pardon.
But he was under contract, and they wanted him to earn his pay, I suppose.
Oh, yes. Sure.
So he got the part back.
Well, he went in and played the part following me.
Uh-huh. Now, how long did you stay in England with Fred Karno before you came to America?
Well, it was just a couple of months or 3 months after that we came to the States, 1910.
Now, this was the company from which Mack Sennett finally took Chaplin for
That's
films
right.
in Hollywood.
That's right.
Now, when Chaplin left for Hollywood,
Yeah.
did anything more happen to you with regard to what Chaplin was
Yes,
doing?
I was... they had further contracts to play in Philadelphia for 12 weeks. So I was notified that I was going to take over and play the part. But the outfit that were running the theaters, the Nixon Nerdlinger Company, refused to take me.
They wanted...
They wanted another comedian, a principal comedian from London.
Oh, I see.
They wanted a London star name. So I lost out again. The first trip that I had here in 1910, we made a trip out to the coast on the Sullivan and Considine circuit.
To this coast?
To the coast here, yes. And I was only getting $20 a week, which when you're traveling like we were, we had to pay our own sleepers, hotels, food, and what have you. Even though everything was very cheap at that time, still $20 wasn't enough to travel on and take care of yourself. So it ended up that there were 3 or 4 of us living in one room, including Chaplin. And so we asked for more money, a couple of us, and they refused to give us a raise. So we left the troupe in Colorado Springs and went back to England, and we put on an act of our own, which we called, for some reason, I don't know why or where the name came from, we called ourselves the Bartow Brothers. Alf Reeves, our manager for the Karno outfit, were back in London. They came back for a couple of months' rest, and we're going out to the States again, so he met me in Leicester Square and wanted to know if I'd like to go back to the States, and they would give me the raise.
Which was a long way around.
Oh, yeah. So, of course, I was very happy to return to the States.
Just talking about the sort of promotion that Karno used, I mean, that really rings bells for the promotion of some of the Laurel and Hardy films, certainly in Britain. Yeah. And in fact, it was Pardon Us was called Jailbirds.
Yeah, it was.
They were I think MGM were recommending the theatre owners, or they employ people to dress up as prison wardens.
Exactly that. And I've read somewhere there was a contemporary report about that, and it said something like, imagine this, what this will, the excitement this will generate or something.
Yeah.
And you wonder whether that was Stan saying to somebody in the publicity department, we used to do this, And there's another similar one with Chaplin, actually, that Karno had a show called Moses and Son, which he promoted by having printed on coins. And supposedly these coins, they had another sketch called Early Birds, where there was a load of coins dropped on the stage in the course of the sketch. And he quickly realised these coins were being pilfered by the cast and rolling into the orchestra pit. So he had some coins made, and we think, anyway, that's what these coins with Moses and Son are written on, because that was his next show. So we think he to promote the show as well.
Wow.
And then if you look at, there's a story of Chaplin and their publicity department, the studio's publicity department, doing exactly that when the Gold Rush came out, that they had coins made with the Gold Rush on and gave the punters at the cinema. So, these things, nothing new. Nothing's ever new.
Well, unless it's come from Karno, and in which case he's new then, by the look of
Perhaps.
it. Fantastic. Perhaps. So we were just talking briefly there. We were touching on the sort of the size of Karno's empire, if you like. I mean, just reading in the book, the size of it is just. Can you just talk a little bit around the scale of the Karno empire as it was?
Well,
in its peak.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem for me with the book really was that it was such a big enterprise, and so many shows and so many performers over such a long time, that, to do it justice in terms of recording the story of the organisation, if you like, and its achievements and his achievements as a performer, but also his personal life and what his family were doing, etc., meant that it was a real editing challenge. I mean, literally, the book was twice as long as it is now. And the last 2 or 3 years, we're literally trying to edit it down. And he worked with Mari Lloyd, was his wife's best friend. He worked with Will Hay, Sandy Powell, Billy Bennett, Frank Randall. It goes on and on and on and on and on, all of whom you could easily write a book about. So you tend to go down a rabbit hole, researching individuals, and it's very difficult to know where to stop. But Karno's empire itself was not only production of sketches and bigger shows like musical theatre and reviews. He also made the scenery, they made props, they made costumes, which were then, for any production, not just his own.
Right.
So the Karno theatrical factory, as he called it, was actually a supplier to the industry in London for 20 years. And as I say, some of the producers licensed his shows and took them abroad. Bert Bernard particularly, who took them to Russia and Australia and so on, often with Karno Comics or ex-Karno Comics. He first took companies to America in 1905, something like that, I think, and had touring companies in America right through to 1914, sorry, and often had 2 or 3 companies touring America at any one time. As I say, 80 productions, a dozen pantomimes, half a dozen film versions of his sketches. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And his career spanned from, he was born in 1866. He eventually, after having been in the circus and kind of a touring itinerant acrobat, he arrived in London in 1888. And that it's easy to know what London was like then, because that was the era Jack the Ripper. Sherlock Holmes was published. So everyone can imagine what London looked like and felt and smelt like in 1888. And in fact, one of the Ripper murders, the last murder, I think, was literally a mile away from where Karno was performing one night in a musical. Sort of imagining walking home that night. Never mind the musical, ladies' chorus. But anyway, so he started in 1880. He was still trying to put shows on it's his death in 1941, which was a couple of months before Pearl Harbor. So you've got this career that spans from Jack the Ripper to Pearl Harbor. And that period in history, social history, is just extraordinary to me. Obviously you've got the aeroplane, the telephone, the motor car, but also Boer War, First World War, Second World War. It's extraordinary. And I found reading a lot of other biographies and a lot of histories of the time frustrated in a way that a biography would often tell the story of the person or their career, or both, but never seemed to quite set it in the context of what was happening.
Yes, yeah.
I was interested to kind of say, well, Karno wrote this sketch called Perkins MP, and the reason that sketch is what it is and what it's all about is because of the suffrage movement that was happening, and suffragettes were a big deal at the time. And if you look at the script of Perkins MP, it's all about this pro-suffragette MP and how he's a laughing stock in Parliament. And Karno used a lot of contemporary events. His sketches, one of the ones I like best is the football match, which was a significant sketch in its own right. It had indoor rain, it had astroturf on the stage. They had an exhibition match, football match on the stage, and they'd get local footballers to come and play. In the sketch, suddenly these local veterans would come out, the crowd would go wild, inevitably. But the sketch itself was inspired by a real-life match-fixing scandal that had happened, which was an FA football scandal with a guy called Billy Meredith, who was a Welsh international, very famous Welsh international, who was accused and found guilty of match-fixing and had a ban accordingly. And Karno's sketch, the football match, he's all about exactly that, somebody trying to fix a match. You can see life mirroring art and vice versa. A really interesting story, which I'll say for someone to read the book. But how he tied that into that sketch was fantastic.
Yes, that's really good.
The subsequent sketch that followed that was another great sketch called The Bailiffs, which many think is the inspiration behind Laurel and Hardy's Bacon Grabbers.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really about two bailiffs trying to repossess a house, or certainly gain access to a house. And it's a double act, Perkins and Meredith. And Meredith is the idiot and Perkins is the straight man in a classic Laurel and Hardy kind of combination. Laurel and Hardy, would have been perfect for that sketch. And they're just trying to gain access to this house. And they're just constantly thwarted. So they try all sorts of things, dressing up as a charwoman and offering to clean the step, trying to be a gas man to read the meter, you name it, they try it. But after every failed attempt, Perkins says, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to knock on the door, pretend to read the meter. Meredith, we're in. And that Meredith, we're in was repeated every time until eventually it just became this saying, this slogan that was literally in the language. And people all over if they achieved their objective, would cry, Meredith, we're in. And then when Billy Meredith came back to play professional football after his ban, every time he kind of got a run on goal, the crowd would be shouting, Meredith, we're in. You got 20,000 people at Old Trafford shouting, we're in. What better advertising is there than that? I mean,
brilliant.
It's all sorts of stories like that.
That's great. I love the. In fact, this is quite a nice little link. There's the bit about the big boat they had on stage that just kept. Yes, they won't detain you. That's right. Yeah, and because did you? I think you speculated there's a link between that and the boat they go on.
Yeah, the story there is that at the time, of course, the only way to get across the Atlantic was with one of the main carriers. The two main Atlantic crossings were either Cunard or White Star at the time. So where are we? 1910, and Karno's companies always travelled with one or the other. Prior to that, and then he wrote this sketch called "Won't Detain You." And now, if people don't know, let me get this the right way around. The Cunard liners were all ended with the suffix "ia," so there was Lusitania, Mauritania, etc. And the White Star liners were all ended in "ic," so it was Titanic, Britannic, Olympic, Cedric, Atlantic, whatever. So Karno, following the Cunard line, went with "Won't Detain You," but the "Won't Detain You" sailed under the It wasn't the White Star Line. I can't quite remember what it was. It's really the White Flag Line. So he kind of was aping both of those companies. And this sketch was on a massive scale. They had a huge liner built on the stage in steel sections, a double deck visible with 40 extras on the 2 decks. The whole thing was on hydraulics. The stage was flooded, and it sat there bobbing at anchor for the start of the sketch. And then the ship would sail off stage. And the ship was as wide as the stage. You know, the pelican was, 50 feet wide or something ridiculous. It would sail off the stage, and a section of the steel hull, once it was in the wings, would be unbolted, whisked around the back, and popped back on the other end. Stage, so it was whisked off stage right, it was popped back on stage left, and therefore the ship just kept going. And, 3 times the width of the theatre, this ship kept sailing.
Yeah.
And it was an extraordinary sight. The audience were, amazed at this spectacle. They're just the hydraulics. They were amazed. The hydraulics, he started showing them as an afterpiece because people were so fascinated by how it worked. The chorus girls were being seasick. And eventually, the final piece of the boat, the stern, is sailing off, and the purser, who was the lead comedian in the sketch, runs along the jetty and dives through the porthole, into the. and then the next scene is a velvet backcloth with a ship sailing in the distance, and a sort of front of tab scene, if you like. Then it follows with a cutaway section. So the ship is then cut away, and you see the inside of the ship set for the grand dining hall. Imagine the Titanic dining hall with, white linen and silver cutlery on one level, and then you see the deck above with the watchman looking for icebergs and all that kind of stuff going on. This is in 1910. But it was all lampooning this cross-channel trade. And the next tour, which happened to be Chaplin's first tour, they did not sail on any of the major lines, shipping lines. They sailed on a converted cattle boat.
Yes.
And, quite why that happened is a bit of a mystery. But I speculate that it's perhaps because Cunard and White Star wouldn't sell him a ticket. And I know that's speculation, but I love the idea of that.
That's brilliant. It was the Cairn Rona, wasn't it?
Cairn Rona, yeah.
Well, we had terrible storms. We took 12 days crossing. And being a cattle boat, the quarters were very uncomfortable, of course. And everybody was ill, seasick. So no rehearsals were ever gotten to. So, of course, we arrived in Monday morning, and the scenery was all brand new. And we weren't familiar with the show at all. So consequently, it was just a big mix-up when we got out there. So Percy Williams was very pleased with the troupe. And we played 4 more theatres for him. Then we were deciding to go back to England. We'd even written home, said we'll be back home, big success. So anyway, during the playing of the Williams houses, Marcus Lowe was opening a brand new theatre in New York called the $1 Million Theatre. It was later called the National. What it is now, or even if it's still there, I don't know. Anyway, at that time, he had a little theater in Fall River. So he sent the troupe down there for 3 days. And if they made good, he was going to put us on the opening show of the new $1 Million Theater. Well, we didn't do the show that we came over with. We picked the one that we were familiar with. That was the Night in an English Music Hall, Mummingbirds, as we call it in England. And the show was a terrific hit because we were all at home with it. We knew every bit of it, you see. So we played a week. They held us over. So, of course, naturally, we opened the National Theatre, or the $1 Million Theatre at that time, with big success. And from there, we went to William Morris, the American Music Hall. And we ran at the American Music Hall for 6 weeks. We did a different show every week. We had a repertoire of shows, and including the one that we flopped in, we'd all gotten together and really became a success. So anyway, from there we went to the American Theater in Chicago for Mars. We played there 3 weeks. Then we came back to the Plaza on Fifth Avenue, New York, and we played there 3 weeks. Then we went to Philadelphia, and we opened the new Nixon Nerdlinger Theater, and we played in Philadelphia for 12 weeks. And then we started out on the Sullivan and Considine circuit. That was the circuit that came to the coast. So it was during that trip that Max Sennett saw Chaplin.
Yeah, their first tour, so that was 1910, September, I think. And they crossed, in fact, the story goes that it should have been Sid Chaplin leading that tour. Right. And by that stage, Karno had started to have some of his comedians who'd gone to America have them poached by American companies. Not so much the film studios, because they were still really, really in their infancy, but other rival production companies. And there were many companies staging Karno sketches, pirating Karno sketches, and they would promote them as being Karno-like. And, there were a number that Karno ended up taking to court and all sorts, but many of them stole away some Karno comics. And if you've been playing the Bradford Alhambra and you're then in, New York or California, double the money and sunshine, it's not hard to see why people were tempted. So he was losing comics, which started to become a real problem. So when the 1910 tour came, he didn't send Sid, and the story goes he was worried that he would lose Sid, and he didn't want to lose him. So he let the little brother go instead. And Charlie by then was a lead comedian in his own right, and had certainly made a name for himself. But he wasn't as popular or as well known or as strong in Karno's eyes as Sid.
Right.
So Chaplin went. Stan was in the same company, as were a number of other comics who later became part of Chaplin's stock company in Hollywood. All comics live in their own right. Silent film comics like Jimmy Aubrey and Albert Austin, Charlie Rogers, and those. A lot of them were ex-Karno comics. I don't think Charlie Rogers was actually on that tour, but he was a Karno comic that went similarly on another tour. They got to America. They toured for 6 or 8 months. They came back in the summer of 1912. So they did whatever that would be, 14 months or something, a bit more. Came back for the summer of 1912 and then went back again for a second series of tours in the autumn of 1912. And it was on one or other of those, depending on which story you read, Max Sennett or one of his team witnessed Chaplin performing. And they ultimately offered Chaplin a job at Keystone, which he eventually accepted. And that left the Karno company a little bit high and dry. They sent out a replacement, Dan Rayner. There is accepted wisdom that when Chaplin left, the Karno company broke up and went home, which isn't correct. Chaplin left in the end of November 1913, and the company with Stan continued to tour until the following May. So another 6 months on the road before it came to the end of that tour. And at that point, most of them went home. Stan decided not to go home. Stayed in the States. But whereas Chaplin went straight into film, Stan went into vaudeville and spent the next however many years, was it 10 years or so, more or less, treading the boards before he really made any impact in the movies. So that's how they ended up in Hollywood. And what we didn't talk about was that Karno's comics were performing, certainly in the early years, entirely in mime. So it was Karno's silent comedians. And the reason for that being that very convoluted law around the difference between legitimate theatre and music hall, in that legitimate theatre, in the early days, you were allowed to have dialogue and therefore plays, and in music hall you were not. And the main reason for that was the Lord Chamberlain needed to review a script and approve it, make sure, and it was a censorship situation. if you were a music hall artist, doing 3 venues a night, sometimes twice a night, from town to town, you just couldn't realistically put that in front of the Lord Chamberlain every 5 minutes. So music halls were exempted from the need for that, but on that basis, they weren't supposed to do dialogue. So you had singers, you had, all sorts of variety performers, including acrobats, and the most you'd get really was a standalone comic or maybe a double act. Even a double act was arguably pushing it a little. Now, gradually, larger companies formed, and Karno was at the very cutting edge of that. So to get around that legislation, all of his comedy was in mime. So it was pure physical acrobatic comedy. And they therefore became masters of this pantomime in the literal sense, and how to create comedy just purely from visual material. So when they then ended up, that changed over time. By 1910, 1912, more and more companies were putting dialogue into shows, and it was almost full-blown musical theatre by the time they eventually scrapped the law, because it was so nonsensical that but for a long time there was a real battle between the theatre managers and the music hall managers, and lots of legal cases and lots of people suing one another. Anyway, so when Karno's comics went to America, and you look at the silent film industry, that industry originally, the actors were drawn from theatre, and they were trying to perform silently, having been theatre actors. So they had to try and learn to be silent actors, which was a challenge. Then suddenly, these troops of comedians came over from England who were fully formed, silent, physical, acrobatic, slapstick comedians, and they were like gold dust. So very quickly, the studio snapped them up. And many of them, Billy Ritchie, Billy Reeves, Jimmy Aubrey, they all became silent comedians. And even who hadn't necessarily gone over there with Karno, but had performed with Karno, like Eric Campbell, Chaplin's best known heavy, he'd been a Karno comedian. Albert Austin I already mentioned, and lots of others. So if you watch a silent comedy from that era, the chances are there are some Karno-trained comedians in there. And even many years later, when Karno was doing review and things, there were still Karno comedians who were finding their way to the States. So remind me, who's the comedian who plays the butler in Oliver the Eight?
Oh, Jack Barty.
So Jack Barty.
Yeah.
Jack Barty had performed with Karno in review in the 20s.
Right.
And actually poached Jack Barty and took him back.
Right.
So even right through that whole 1910 to 1925, really, Karno was still churning out these comedians that were just consistently nicked by the studios. So then of course when it then changed to sound in whatever it was, 27-ish, then the opposite problem happened. You've got all these actors and comedians who'd been performing in mime suddenly trying to learn to talk. But people don't often think of the reverse being the case when first started, because all those theatre actors were struggling to understand how to.
Of course, you never don't think about that part.
So it was quite interesting. And that's why
that's brilliant.
Was so popular when they got over there with the studio.
Yeah, as you say, gold dust. Yeah, quite literally. So moving on just slightly, Stan sort of starts to move away from the vaudeville stages, and he's trying to break into film. And he's friends with Karno Jr., isn't he? Fred Karno Jr. as well, and they work together in some of Stan's solo films. Yeah,
Fred Jr. was in that same first 1910 touring company, although he went home when Stan stayed on. But in 1922, I think, 23, Fred Jr. went back to the States, pretty much his own volition, with his wife, and got himself a job with Hal Roach, which I'm certain Stan must have engineered. And so Fred Jr. appears in a number of early Stan Laurel solo comedies like Near Dublin and Zeb versus Paprika and Smithy and one or two others of that era. And you blink and you'll miss him. But there is one little section in near Dublin, I think, where near Dublin is all about brickworks, isn't it? I think Jimmy Finlayson is the boss of a brickworks or something, and there's lots of brick throwing. And there's a scene where they're kind of bobbing for apples or something, and you end up one of them ends up blindfolded, and there's a brick on a string. and that little exchange, which ends up in the sort of fisticuffs, is between Stan and Fred Jr. And Stan actually put Fred Jr. up at his house in LA. Not only did he give him a job, he gave him a house as well.
That's typical Stan.
And the problem was that Fred Jr. wasn't really a chip off the old block in terms of talent. In later years, Fred Jr. became quite an accomplished review comedian. I think he was more of a light comedian, more of a song and dance man, I think, than a physical acrobat. And I think that's the reason he didn't particularly excel in silent film. He was never a lead comic in Karno's own companies. And he did whatever it was, 7 or 8 films with Hal Roach, and then disappeared. He actually went back to vaudeville with Charlie Hall, who he got very friendly with, Hal Roach. And Charlie and Fred Jr. and Fred's wife Queenie jumped in a car and went on tour. And Charlie and Queenie eventually gave up and went back to Hollywood, and Fred Jr. carried on as a solo comedian, found himself in Canada. His visa expired. He couldn't get back.
Yeah, that's right.
He disappeared for the next 10 years.
Yeah, I love this. I love the story where Fred Jr. and Charlie Hall are traveling to San Francisco, I think it was, and the radiator on their Model T starts spurting. And was it? They stopped off at the store.
They stop at a garage, and Fred Jr. fills the radiator with porridge or breakfast cereal of some description. And that seems to cure it. So they carry on driving along, and then the next thing they know, it seems to be snowing, in Arizona or wherever it is they are. And they get out, they open the bonnet, and this just explodes with this porridge that has literally sort of grown. And that was used, of course, in, I think it's The House Go, isn't it?
The Who's Go, yeah. In fact, it was originally in Bacon Grabbers. Funnily enough, it was filmed in Bacon Grabbers, but it was deleted.
That's right. Yeah,
after.
Yeah. And I've got
with Charlie Hall. In fact, Charlie Hall was actually in that scene.
So you imagine that must have come from Charlie Hall telling the story.
Yeah.
Because Charlie certainly told it of Fred Jr. in later life.
Stop it! Now what are we gonna do? I don't know. We can watch it. Oh, shut up! Hey! I'll tell you how to stop that leak. Put some rice in the radiator. Get some from the cook tent. You go get it and I'll watch this. Now hurry up, too.
But yeah, Fred Jr. just disappeared for many years, and then he eventually reappeared in the 30s. So yeah, there's loads of interesting, really good stories. And actually going back to Stan's solo films, you can see a lot of Karno gags in both Stan's solo films and in Chaplin films. I mean, some of the Chaplin films are clearly inspired by Karno sketches. The Rink is clearly inspired, if not a copy of a Karno sketch called Skating. And there are many, many others. But Stan's are a bit harder to spot because you really do need to know the Karno sketches inside out in order to be able to spot a Karno gag. But they're there. And don't ask me the names of the Laurel solo films, but there's one where he's a drunk in a cafe and he's trying to light a cigarette off an electric light bulb, for instance. That is straight out of Mummingbirds. There's another film where he's in a laundry and it ends up with all the laundry overflowing and soap suds everywhere, and that's pretty much from a sketch called what's it called? I call it the Steam Laundry, which is a Karno sketch. There's loads of references you can see, and allegedly, Hal Roach used to say that Chaplin would come running over to the studio, quite frequently, and say to Stan, "Well, what was that thing we used to do in Mummingbird?"
Yeah.
So there's clearly Karno DNA in that material. But having read lots of books about Chaplin particularly, and Stan to an extent, but Chaplin, a lot of biographers have kind of put two and two together and made five and said, oh, well, this must be Easy Street, Chaplin's Easy Street must be based on Karno's Early Birds because they're both down and outs and what have you. And there's just this assumption that it's the same. Actually, when you look at the script, it's nothing, absolutely nothing like the same story, but perhaps a setting. But what you do see is just individual little gags that could have come from any of Karno's sketches. And there's just this treasury of material that Chaplin and Stan and all of those other comedians were able to draw on throughout their career and build on and add to. And Karno, to his credit, always said that about, most people who'd even passed Chaplin in a corridor would have claimed to have worked with him and, been there. But Karno was relatively modest about that and always said, I didn't teach Chaplin everything he knows, but there's a lot of things that we did that Chaplin has certainly used and developed and made his own, which is...
Yeah. As you do through your career, of course, you learn as you go, don't you? In every walk of your career. So if we could just touch a little bit on Karno's, not his downfall, but he starts to fall on hard times. And I mean, there's so much in the book that it's just fascinating reading. The Casino, I think, is an amazing just project that he undertook.
Yeah, well, it's a book in itself, the Casino, really. Since his youth, he'd spent time upriver at Molesey and a place called Tagg's Island, which is very near Hampton Court. And they used to go there on the train. It was the end of the line from Waterloo, and people would holiday upriver, And he'd been there as a busker when he was starting out, and then later, when he became very wealthy, he built this extraordinary houseboat called the Astoria, which is still there and maintained pretty much as it was in Fred's day. And it's solid mahogany and teak and lead crystal windows and a marble bathroom. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Cost, I don't know, £11,000 or £12,000 in 1910, I think. Which was a lot of money then. And he lived on this boat for a while. And then Tagg's Island had a pub on it, and a fairly old pub and hotel, Thames Island Hotel. And it came up for lease. And he decided that was his next big thing. And he took a 40-year lease on the island, intended to spend £10,000 refurbishing this old hotel, and ended up demolishing it and rebuilding it. Engaged Frank Matcham as his architect, the greatest theatre architect ever in Britain, and spent $140,000, which in 1912 was an awful lot of money. And unfortunately, it saddled him with debt that, frankly, over time, gradually dragged him down. And the consensus is he built Casino and he bankrupted it, which is not quite true. He built Casino and it opened in 1913. And it was the place to be. It was very, very successful. They had 5,000 people on the first day. And it was certainly somewhere that the rich and the famous and the it crowd were keen to be. He did reasonably well for the first season. And then it all went horribly wrong because World War I came along.
Right.
And prior to World War I, his clientele upriver were those three men in a boat in the striped blazers and the boats, and 4 years later, they were gone. Not only physically gone, many of them, but actually the world had just changed. It had modernised dramatically. So that was a real problem. The war caused him all sorts of financial difficulties. And at the same time, music halls started to decline. It changed to more review, more variety, and that was sort of death knell for him. But he ran that hotel till 1927. So, it actually was in his ownership and operating for 14 years. It certainly wasn't an overnight disaster by any means, but it was the last few years. The World War I caused him serious problems. The original cost of it was a debt he just couldn't sustain. And then when music hall faded away after World War I, which was obviously his key source of income, the empire gradually dwindled. It just pushed him to the point where financially he hit a brick wall and was eventually bankrupted in 1927. And then he lost everything: the boat, the house, the fun factory, the hotel. And he was literally penniless at first. Then do you roll over and die, or do you bounce back? And he bounced back in some style.
Yeah.
So, he kind of got on a boat to Hollywood, pretty much, at that point. And again, in his own account, he claims to have been made an offer from William Morris, who very famous agent in New York, to go and write material for the Marx Brothers. Now, again, previous biographers and people who know a lot more about this than I do have suggested that's probably highly unlikely. And yet, now we have Karno's own correspondence confirming that's what happened. So, the sort of thing that in his personal letters, that he wouldn't otherwise be able to say with any certainty. It does sound unlikely, but the letter is there. So clearly that's what happened. So he went over to New York, but he went without a contract. So it seems to have been pretty much on a back of a conversation. He found himself in New York, ironically, the Astoria Studios. And the boss of Paramount then was Jesse Lasky. And Jesse Lasky had known Karno for many, many years, because Lasky used to be an agent and had often brought acts over to Britain and vice versa, and knew Karno through pantomime work together and all sorts of things. So it was Lasky really who was the boss of the studio. When he got Lasky either refused to take his calls or wouldn't let him in, or he was kind of kicking his heels for a week. Kept getting messages from the studio saying, yeah, we'll call you. And eventually just gave up. When you actually look at what was happening with the Marx Brothers at the time, they were making film versions of their well-established stage shows. There was really no need for a new writer. They had well-established writing team. You can't quite work out how that might have even come about, except to say maybe somebody thought Karno might have some material that would be good for Harpo. Is the only thing you can kind of think.
Right, yeah.
But you can certainly understand why there's a lot of scepticism around that idea. But that the correspondence suggests that's what happened. Anyway, having got ultimately the cold shoulder once he got there, he jumped on the train to Hollywood and went and looked up his old alumni, by then the biggest stars in LA, and went and knocked on Charlie Chaplin's door. Chaplin gave him a tour of the studio, took him out for dinner, took him to various mansions, showed him around his home, took him to Marion Davis's house for dinner, and Karno was overwhelmed. And then Karno never saw him again. I suggest he changed the locks on the studio.
That's right.
So Karno
that's right. I was thinking about that. You could kind of imagine, Karno arrives and Chaplin's really, over the moon to see him, takes him out and dines him and all the rest of it. Oh, and they meet Irving Berlin in the evening, and Irving Berlin is starstruck to meet Fred Karno, which I thought was amazing. But then you can kind of imagine Chaplin then thinking, hang on a minute, do I really want my old gaffer working for me? Because he must have felt, he must have looked up to Karno, but he wants to be to be the top dog now, doesn't he? So
I can think of plenty of old bosses I've had. Into my office now, I wouldn't be. It would be difficult to work with them because just that's the nature of the relationship. So he went and knocked on Stan's door, and in contrast, Stan, I think, persuaded Hal Roach to give him a job. But to be fair, as Hal Roach said at the time, I'd had 10 years of, hearing from Laurel and Chaplin and Jimmy Aubrey and Albert Austin and everybody else how, amazing Fred Karno was. This guy turns up at my door, willing and wanting to do a job for me. I gave him a chance. And that, again, the story of Karno's time at the Roach Studios, there's really only ever been one version of that. And that is pretty much from Hal Roach, who has said, or did say, when actually Karno was there, it turned out he was a businessman, not really a writer, not really a comic, not really a gag man. He was a businessman, went around the studio, took lots of photographs, but didn't really didn't really bring any value, and therefore kind of he wasn't for us. So much more complex than that, because we now have Karno's letters home throughout that period, which tell the story of what was actually happening, the rumour mill that was going, what he was asked to do, what he was not asked to do, where he fell out with people, what went well, what went wrong, and the backdrop again of other social history. He got there in September 1929. A month later, the Wall Street crash happened. The wheels fell off, the studios, many of the studios. Hal Roach was a little bit more successful than some others. But nonetheless, it was a very difficult time economically for the studios. And the letters seem to clearly demonstrate that Karno was largely a victim of that, really. But really, it's such an interesting story that I'm sure that listeners to your podcast will find that particularly interesting. And I won't give too many spoilers, but that really, as you say, that's a really interesting take on what was perceived to be a slightly different story.
Because I think he was taken on. He was contracted for 5 years, and I think he lasted 4 months.
Like that.
I think that was the term, something like that. Which, But as you say, we've only ever had the one story before now, which is fascinating. And the other story that I really just leaps out, again, involves Charlie Hall. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
There is a little bit of speculation on my part there, to say the least. But I mean, where I've speculated in the book that something is my view of something, I've tried to make that clear. So people can see that this isn't, I'm not presenting it as fact. But what we do know is that Karno said when he got to America, he found the studios full of Karno comics. Not unsurprisingly, his alumni were everywhere. Men and women. He had a lot of female comics, actually, as well. But he also came across some people who claimed to have been Karno comics who had not been. And he describes particularly one man that he met who, when he arrived at the studio, came to him in a panic and said, I'm really sorry, but I kind of told everybody that I was a Karno comic, and I will be very grateful if you don't give me away because my entire career has been based on it. And if you look at who was there at the time, who was working in the studio, it must have been an English comic who could have been a credible Karno comic in terms of age and background and so on. It must have been someone who Stan Laurel would have gone along with that lie.
Yeah. Because
Stan would have known that person was or wasn't a Karno comic. So on top of that, on that basis, Charlie Hall is a suspect. Yeah. Because Charlie was not a Karno comic. He was British and he was very friendly with Stan.
Yeah.
And he had made a career for himself, clearly. In addition to that, Charlie had been friends with Fred Jr. and had been on vaudeville with Fred Jr. So it is easy to see how Charlie Hall could have said, I have worked with Fred Karno. That would not have been a lie.
Yes.
It was Fred Karno Jr., not Fred Karno Sr. And either he let that misunderstanding, lie, or whether it was more deliberate than that. But anyway, you can understand how it could have been Charlie. But that's the supposition, except Karno was not the sort of man to let someone get away with that. He was contractual, he was litigious, he was very quick to protect his own material and so on. So you then have to ask yourself, well, why would Karno have gone along with that? Because he said, I agreed to kind of go along with the line. And Charlie Hall was really good friends, not just with Stan, who by then was Karno's benefactor, but also with Queenie Karno, who was Fred Karno Jr.'s wife. Although Fred Jr. had disappeared, Queenie was still in Hollywood, very friendly with Charlie. Queenie had got 2 sons, Fred Karno's grandsons. So effectively, if Karno had exposed Charlie Hall, then that would have been an absolute bomb in the middle of his family grew. It would have caused problems for Stan, because Stan must have vouched for him. So on the basis of that, I have suggested that it could have been Charlie Hall.
I love it. I love it.
But it's a nice story. And it also explains why in every book you read, Charlie Hall's, or almost every book, apart from the great John Uller, who...
Yes,
correct, Charlie Hall is stated as being an ex-Karno comic, which you...
That's right.
So there's all sorts of little bits of detective work and a bit of supposition, but there's logic.
Yeah. No, I love it. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I love it. As you say, it's just a great story. I mean, I love Charlie Hall. So when I read that, it was just
absolutely.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So his time was very brief with the Roach Studios. So what happened to Karno after he left?
Well, he took his time coming back in a way. He decided to have a road trip across the States. He got a Model A Ford, I think it was, and drove Route 66 from LA to Chicago. And I say in the book that journey in itself in 1930, spring of 1930, sorry. He left Hollywood in that Chaplin era, that golden age of Hollywood, drove through what became the Dust Bowl. The Wall Street crash had just happened, drove through what became the Dust Bowl of the Midwest, the Grapes of Wrath and all that, found his way up through into Chicago within weeks of the Valentine's Day massacre. Al Capone was king of the town. He then drove down into New York as the Empire State Building was literally half built. The Chrysler Building was just being topped out. And that little snapshot of American culture in whatever it was, 3 weeks or something it took him to drive that journey. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So he jumped on a boat, he came home, and in his own autobiography or his biography, he said that he didn't do anything for a few years and sort of licked his wounds, but that's not correct. Error of his own memory, he very quickly put on a new show called Laughs, and that was very much a knockabout, chaotic, free-for-all, but it actually took things a bit further in that he allowed his comics to interfere with the audience, to run through the foyer, to interrupt the other acts on the bill and cause chaos, and steal the jugglers' clubs and knock the magician's hat off. And so it was almost like the Karno comedians ran amok throughout this variety bill, and to the point where, their names were upside down in the programme. And it became this breaking of the fourth wall into the audience was actually quite innovative. And Karno started to do it with one or two shows earlier, but this was real mayhem.
Yeah.
And not very long after that, the team at the Palladium, George Black and Val Purnell, I think it was, at the Palladium, did a similar thing with put together some comedians and let them run riot. And it was a series of double acts, Norton and Gold, and ultimately Flanagan and Allen, and one or two others, and Nervo and Knox. Now, Jimmy Nervo had been a Karno comedian, and they did a very similar thing. And it's quite a convoluted story as to how you get there, but you can see that there are connections that suggest that the Karno show was an inspiration for it. Subsequently, George Black then licensed Laughs to actually become the show that became the Crazy Gang. And the Crazy people might, if they remember the Crazy Gang even, was this sort of trio of double acts, ultimately Nervo and Knox, Norton and Gold, Flanagan Allen, and a solo comedian magician called Eddie. Oh God, my memory. Monsieur Eddie Gray. But there were actually lots of other comics that had also been kind of honorary members in and out. And the idea of these crazy weeks took the country by storm. It was not just the Crazy Gang at the Palladium. There were comedians doing it all over the country. And it was it just suddenly became a trend for that year. And Karno was very much at the heart of that. Subsequently, Flanagan and Allen actually then appeared in Karno film versions of his sketches, and there was a very close connection between all that going on. So he did Laughs, and the Crazy Gang went on to become really the comedy sensation of the 30s and ended up right through till the late 50s, having been revived after the war by Jack Hilton, who was also a Karno comic in his youth. It's wheels within wheels, and the Karno tentacles reach everywhere. So the Crazy Gang was probably the biggest comedic influence of the 30s and 40s in Britain. And then when you couple comedians like Sandy Powell, Billy Bennett, Will Hay, Frank Randall, that generation, which was very much the sort of 30s into the 40s, and they were that probably the last of the Karno comics, but nonetheless, yet another generation of superstars that had come through the Karno school.
Yes, yeah. Was it everything comes from Karno? Was that Simon Lubish?
Yeah, and he's right.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Absolutely amazing. So, I mean, that was it's a fascinating. I mean, we really have just touched on tiny bits of the story. That it's well worth grabbing a copy of the book for any Laurel and Hardy fan, Chaplin fan, as you say. I mean, the list goes on, all the different comics, but just comedy in general. And I know when I came to the book launch, you talked in your presentation. You were talking about the sort of the character assassination that had happened previously with the previous books of Karno, and how you've tried to sort of balance it really and just try and correct it. So, this sort of book, I guess, is your opportunity to try and sort of set the record straight a little bit. So how would you like Karno to be remembered from here forward? What's your kind of your aim?
Well, I think he had a darker side, as many characters do and did, and Chaplin and Sid Chaplin and even Laurel and Hardy had their own messy divorces and relationships with their wives and so on, and everyone has skeletons and dark things in cupboards. But the volume of his work, the body of his work, and the influence is so extraordinary. It's almost impossible to understate it. And I read on one of the Laurel and Hardy websites, someone had not read the book but had read a review, and they more or less said, I don't believe for a minute that Karno was anywhere near as influential as this review suggests. And I replied and just said, just read the book and let me know.
Read the book.
Let me know what you think, because the more work I did on it, the more amazed I was how influential this guy is. Now, if you imagine, I think if you asked people now who were the biggest influences on modern comedy culture and film, they would go to Charlie Chaplin, I'm sure. They would go to Laurel and Hardy. And if they were fans of British film of the 30s and 40s, they would go to The Crazy Gang. They'd go to Will Hay. They'd go to some. Now, if you then pick those 10, 12, 15 key influencers, the biggest one being Chaplin, and say, well, actually, the root of all of them is Karno, well, then you start to see. And then when you understand that he also absolutely pioneered self-promotion, he was the first to put a revolve on a stage in Britain. He more or less invented the breeches roll, not the breeches roll, but he invented principal boy boots for girls in pantomime. There's all sorts of little things. He was an absolutely huge pioneer of pathos in comedy. You can see how that developed in his sketches, and that then was taken on by Chaplin and Laurel to a certain extent. The influence is just impossible to ignore. However, what frustrates me slightly is the kind of Hal Roach approach, which is Karno was just an impresario. He was just a business, because he was a businessman, very, very successful one. But actually, he was a damn good comic and acrobat. And when you dig back into his early career, he was just a superstar comedian. And then he was the lead comedian in his own company for 10 years before it got bigger than him. And he had to, and he was getting older, and he stepped back and started to just run the empire. And I say in the book, I think he would probably want to be remembered as a performer and a comedian, I think.
That's fair.
In fact, there's a line where he says in his book, or I think it was in a newspaper article. He had made a film version of one of his sketches quite late in life, and having not performed for quite a long time, but he went back and played the lead in this sketch on film, and he only did it once. And he said in this report, "I don't think I'll do it again because I found I couldn't do comedy without the audience response."
Right. Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
that to me tells you more than anything that this guy was a performer. Now, this is someone who needed the audience. He was working the laughs out. That we were saying earlier about being able to read a laugh and when to time your next gag, and that comes from live performance, and that clearly was what he saw himself as. And so I just like him to be remembered and valued for his contribution, really. And I know that's what his descendants would like, for sure.
Well, you've done an excellent job in putting the case forward for Fred Karno, and as you say, he is a man who cannot be ignored, and absolutely right. David, it's been fantastic to chat to you about this, and now I can't let you go. Every new guest that comes on the show has to face the atoll question.
Okay.
Now, okay, it's called the Atoll question. I don't know if you're aware. The very final Laurel and Hardy film was Atoll K.
I'm afraid I am aware of that.
Okay, we'll leave that there. Let's not go down that road. So you are about to be stranded on a deserted atoll, but you are being allowed to take with you 4 Laurel and Hardy related items with you. You can have a Laurel and Hardy silent short, a talkie short, a feature film, and a Laurel and Hardy related book. Now, I'm aware that you're not coming into this as a Laurel and Hardy super fan or all the rest of it. So if you're not as familiar with a lot of the films, then that's fine. I will accept that. But
listen, I'm a proud son of the desert, and whilst I am no Laurel and Hardy scholar, I have watched, I think, the vast majority of Laurel and Hardy films because I love them, and for research purposes, but also, our Sons of the Desert meetings, when I'm able to go, John always puts on, a couple of films. They're always fantastic. My kids come. Brilliant. I'm going to have a good fist at this.
That's good. That's excellent. That's fine. Let's get into it. I will also give you a bonus choice as well, which I try and do and sort of gear it towards the guest's particular point of interest. So, as well as a Laurel and Hardy related book, I'm going to let you choose another book on any other comic or comedy related theme, because obviously you've probably been through quite a number, I would suggest, in researching your book. So you can kind of mull that one off at the side. We'll do that at the end. So we'll start, if we can, with your Laurel and Hardy silent short.
Well, it's tricky, this, because probably films that I like not because they're necessarily the best Laurel and Hardy films. I like them for other reasons.
Good.
So I like Bacon Grabbers because it's potentially inspired by the Bailiffs, so that's got a soft spot.
Yeah.
I like Big Business just because it's brilliant. But the silent short that struck me the most when I watched them all was Liberty, actually.
Oh, yeah.
I love it anyway. It's a great film, but it still had. I'm a bit scared of heights, and it still had the ability to make me go, "Ooh."
Yes, that's it.
Which is saying something when you're watching a 100-year-old film. And I just think it's brilliant. I really think they're brilliant in it.
There's a great film. And interesting also that Liberty comes out of the sort of the offcuts of the previous film. We Fall Down. So it's I love how they've sort of used what was the waste product and made it into a fabulous comedy on its own.
Film, and there's some really nice touches where they're trying to sort the trousers out in alleys, and I know that that you could argue, well, it's derivative of Harold Lloyd and all that kind of stuff, but I think it just stands alone as a great film, and I really enjoy watching it, and I've watched it many times.
Great choice.
So that'd be my choice as a silent short, I think.
Great choice. That's a great choice. And your talkie short. This is even harder.
It's much harder. And I think my favourite Laurel and Hardy film ever, in terms of the film I remember watching as a kid that stuck in my mind, was Toad in a Hole.
Yeah.
I love Toad in a Hole. I've read lots of stuff on Laurel and Hardy by people who know better than I do, telling me it's not particularly a strong film or it's not as good as that. But I love it. I love it from the blowing of the trumpet And tell me that again.
Tell me that again. Well, if you caught a fish, and whoever you sold it to, they wouldn't have to pay for it, then the profits would go to the fish. If you caught... I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
There's one little tiny visual that I love where Stan is cleaning the anchor, and he puts the brush in the bucket and he cleans his leg by mistake. It's such a tiny little thing. It's so beautifully done. I've shown that to many people. When I've been doing pantomime or directing, I've shown that to so many people. Said, just look at this. He doesn't make a big deal of it. It's not blown up into some kind of follow-on gag. It's just a beautiful, tiny little bit of nonsense.
Bit of business.
That. So I love Toad in the Hole. I also have a big soft spot for Below Zero.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because Below Zero was being made when Karno was still with Hal Roach, and Wall Street Crash had happened, and actually this whole kind of genre of films at the time had started to show hobos and down and outs and reflecting what was going on in real life. So the fact Karno was around, I quite like it. And I surmise in the book that maybe that fact Karno was there may have inspired Stan to think about a bit more pathos. Whether that's right or not is neither here nor there. But I quite like it for that reason. I love Blotto simply because of Stan's giggling in that scene in the nightclub. I used to, when I started in amateur, just as an aside, when I started in theatre, I had a comedy double act partner, many years older than me, still around, John, is superb, Johnny West. And he used to say, I can make you laugh at nothing at all. And he used to go up to people and he just used to put his finger in the air and look at the end of his finger and start laughing. And within 30 seconds, the other person would be giggling. And if he tried hard enough, he could really... That ability to just laugh, it's
amazing.
It's
isn't
amazing.
It?
So I love the way Stan does that.
Yeah.
But if I have to choose one, and this won't be a popular choice, I'd have to choose Night Owls.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay. Interesting.
Night Owls is certainly not perceived to be anywhere near any of Laurel and Hardy's best. But it's the only film we know for certain Karno was there on the set.
Yeah.
There are photographs of him on the set. When we did my stage version of Karno's story, Chaotic, back in 2010, it was the only Laurel and Hardy film that we recreated on stage. With permission, of course. And so we recreated that live in a theatre. And it was just joyous. It was just superb. And therefore,
that's great.
If I had to have one to watch over and over again, it would be that.
That is fantastic. I've got to say as well, those stills with Karno on the set, when the Jimmy Parrott's face is an absolute scream.
Who is this bloke?
Did you say it was murderous looks he's giving? Yeah. And I think Babe's face is pretty nonplussed as well. He's not quite understanding what's going on. But Stan is beaming, I think, in most of them.
So for that reason, if I had to choose one, it would probably be Night Owls.
Oh, it's the cat, sir. Let's pretend we're cats. Do something about it.
Brilliant. That's great. That's great. I think you are the first person to have night owls on their island, so that's absolutely wonderful. I love it. And moving on to your feature film.
I'm going to be honest here. I don't know the features as well as the shorts. Quite a few I haven't seen, but of those I have seen, the one that I love is Sons of the Desert. I just love the premise of it. I love the silliness of it. I love them hiding in the attic. I love the fact they get caught on camera. I think the wife is brilliant. I just think it's great. I think it's a great film, and I think it hangs together as a feature. Some of the features you sort of feel a little bit forced. The ones I've seen, that it's either it's a bit overstretched, or. But I remember watching Sons of the and not really feeling like it was a feature. You know,
it feels like a short. It does feel like a short. Yeah, absolutely.
So that'd be my choice for a feature.
And furthermore, you're making a big mistake.
What do you mean?
If you're not careful, she's going to get the upper hand of you. Now mark my words.
The upper hand of me. Impossible.
All right, have it your own way. You know, I may not be king of my castle, but I certainly wouldn't allow my wife to wear any pants. I'd like to see my old woman throwing things around. It's disgraceful. Never heard of such goings off. On. You know, if my ball and chain ever talked to me, if she even dared to raise a... Do you know what I'd say?
What?
I'd say... Hello, honey. Well, you think it over. I'll see you in the morning.
Excellent choices. Excellent choices. And a Laurel and Hardy related book.
Well, I've read an awful lot of them. I suppose if I had one book on a desert island, it would have to be Randy's The Magic Behind the Movies, I guess. Just because it is so comprehensive. You know, it's the Bible, and you could never get bored of reading it because there is so much material there. As a desert island choice, I think it would have to be that. But I have to have a nod out to AJ Marriott because his meticulously researched books, particularly on the stage careers, obviously of Stan and Charlie Chaplin, were so helpful to me with my book and many other researchers who, frankly, have stood on his shoulders and benefited from that work. So I have to put a shout out to AJ and say, you know, I'd like to take one of his books too. Maybe Laurel stage by stage. Yeah,
no, excellent books. I remember when the British Tours book first came out, the little hardback, you know, beautiful book, and it was such a. It was incredible to see how he'd researched day to day. You felt like you were following the boys around the country. And then from then on, whenever I was going to visit, you know, a town somewhere, I just have a quick look to see if they'd been in that town, so I could find the theatre. And fabulous.
I think those books have brought so much value to people who are genuinely interested in Laurel Hardy, and I know how much work went into them because I've shared the pain. So
but I think also, you know, for people such as you and I from the UK, Hollywood is a million miles away. The British Tours books brings the boys to us. It makes us feel like we have a connection to those guys, even though they were, you know,
absolutely.
Were from.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah,
fantastic, great choices. And so you have a bonus choice. So any other film-related, comedy-related book you would recommend?
Somebody said to me, "Why did it take you 10 years to write this book?" And not only have I had 2 kids and built a house and run a business and done all sorts of other things, and 15 pantomimes.
Excuses.
But I've worked out. I'd read best part of 100 books, other biographies, or you know, film histories or musical histories or whatever. And one book stood out to me, even though it's just a little nothing you'd never have heard of it book, and it's called Blow My Own Horn, I think it's called, and it's actually Jesse Lasky's autobiography. Jesse Lasky started as a cornet player, American, and he was a success on the music hall with his sister, I think, and then he formed his own little band, and then he became an agent and became quite a successful agent. He ended up owning his own theatres in New York. He ended up as a bankrupt. He clawed his way back again, and it was pretty much Jesse Lasky and Cecil B. DeMille who founded Hollywood, really. So Lasky was working as an agent in New York. Cecil B. DeMille was a playwright working with Lasky, and Cecil B. DeMille decided it was, you know, there was no future in it. He was going to run off to join the Mexican War or something, unless there was something else they could come up with. So Lasky suggested, why didn't he go and have a go at making movies? And this was in 1912 or something. So Cecil B. DeMille drove out to Arizona, I think, originally, or certainly the Midwest, to try and find somewhere sunny and to do it, and couldn't find anywhere. It's carried on to this dusty place called Hollywood, and found a barn on the corner of Hollywood and Vine or somewhere, and created a film studio in it. And that barn is still there. It's called the Lasky DeMille Barn.
Oh wow!
And I was in LA 6 weeks ago and drove. I didn't know it was still there until I drove past it, and I went, "Oh my god!" Anyway, Lasky then went on to become the head of Paramount. Well, he had his own studio. All various studios merged, and he became the head of Paramount. So he was this huge movie mogul, but he was there right at the start. He was a friend of Karno's. Yeah. There's so many good stories in it. But what's really interesting about the book is it's just a good story. He went as a teenager to try and prospect for gold in the Yukon, and he lost his foot to frostbite, and it's just a brilliant story. It's a very old book. If you find a copy, it'll be a dusty dog. Of all the books I read, that one stood out to me. So, Blow My Own by
fantastic.
Jesse Lasky, I strongly recommend.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I'm making a note of that. That sounds excellent. Brilliant stuff. David, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been just amazing to talk about Fred Karno, and what a fascinating character he is. And I will wholeheartedly recommend everybody pick up a copy of Fred Karno, The Legend Behind the Laughter. There will be a link where people can click straight on and go and purchase their own copy from in the podcast show notes. So yeah, Fred. I call you Fred now. David, thank you so much indeed. You're going to be known as Fred Karno guy. I'll take that any day. Brilliant. David, thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Patrick. God bless you.
So there you have it. What a fascinating character Karno was, and I can wholeheartedly recommend David's book. Now, we really did only scratch the surface today. There is so much more entertaining information in the book, including the details of what really happened during Karno's brief employment at the Hal Roach Studios. As I mentioned earlier, it's a big book. It's about 600 glossy pages with plenty of wonderful images to illustrate the story, including a number of Stan and Chaplin that I've never seen before. Priced at only £20, it's an absolute bargain. The book is called Fred Karno, The Legend Behind the Laughter, and it's published by Bruin Books. You can find my affiliate link to purchase the book from Amazon in the show notes and on the Laurel and Hardy blog website. And this just means that if you purchase the book using my link, you don't have to pay any more, but Amazon give me a small amount for sending you their way. And that helps to support the future of the blogcast. And so that's all there is. There isn't any more. On the next show, episode 24, we resume service as usual. We'll be taking a deep dive into the boys' two-reeler Habeas Corpus, and we'll be joined by an expert on classic scare comedies, Paul Castiglia. So I look forward to seeing you there, and we can't leave today without saying thank you to our brilliant guest, David Crump, and of course to the Bohunks Orchestra for the superb music. Affiliate links to buy CDs of their music can always be found in the show notes and on the Laurel and Hardy blog website too. Don't forget, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave me a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you can leave one. And to keep updated with everything related to the blogcast and also my upcoming book, Laurel and Hardy Silence, please sign up for my free newsletter at blogheads.com. So finally, a huge thank you for listening. Please get in touch with me by email or on the many social media pages. And until next time, it's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
And it's a very goodbye from me. Goodbye.